Welcome to the second episode of the new series, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness, here on Sefer Chatter. And I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode, we'll follow up on the first episode, which was a broad overview of the entire legend, with this episode being a look at the 12 tribes, all the tribes generally. I think when discussing lost tribes here, as the series is going to do, it's important to understand what the tribes were generally, what their various attributes were, their characteristics, and what it is that we're missing with them not being here today. It's easy to say it's just, there's some Jews missing, but it's more than that, and what it is that we're missing. And that's what this is, this episode, a Torah-based look at this through the sources. And it's also appropriate that this episode is being posted Parshas Vayechi, with the berachos of Yaakov Avinu being to the various Shevatim. I was asked by a devoted listener to lay out the order of the rest of the series. And while it's not set in stone, I think it is useful to kind of lay out the rough parameters for the listener. So the first episode was a general overview. The second episode, this one began being an overview on the tribes, generally all the tribes. The third episode will be an episode on the Sambatyon River and the legend associated with that. The fourth episode being an episode about Eldad Hadani, the mysterious, shadowy figure that appears in 9th century Kairouan, modern-day Tunisia, claiming to be a part of the tribe of Dan. Going forward, there'll be episodes on the lost tribes in the 15th and 16th century, kind of in Europe, what the feel was about them, kind of the late medieval, early modern period. There will be an episode about the Red Jews and the Maisak Damas. The Red Jews are kind of in German and Old Yiddish literature. That's what they became associated. It was a phrase associated with the lost tribes. There'll be an episode about David Ruveni. He claims he's the brother of the king of Reuven, Gad, and half of Menashe, and he shows up in Italy in the 16th century. There will also be an episode about Prester John. He's the Christian parallel, so to speak, in some ways, not exactly to the lost tribes. The lost tribes come up in that story, so that's not a Jewish story, but it's very important for this story, as you'll hear. There'll also be an episode on Antonio de Montezinos Aaron Halevi, the Marano converso, who appears with his story that he saw the tribe of Reuben and the lost tribes in South America, and this inspires the famous Dutch rabbi Menashe ben Israel to petition Oliver Cromwell to let the Jews back in England. There'll also be an episode on Menashe ben Israel and his book, The Hope of Israel, Mikvah Yisrael, which he discusses this, and especially the Hebraic Indian theory, the idea that the Native Americans were descendants of the lost tribes. There'll be, in general, an episode about the Hebraic Indian theory, as well as an episode about Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov and the Bnei Moshe. He is one of the Talmidei of the Vilna Gaon, and they're searching for the lost tribes. There will also be an episode about the tribes in the Ethiopian Jews and general South African tribes, as well as Indian Jews and that part. There'll also be an episode about some other, and there'll be like one or two more episodes, not sure exactly. But that's kind of roughly the rough parameters, and feel free to reach out via email, sefarmchatter@gmail.com, or to message me. The corporate sponsor of this series, as always, is Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full-service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And please tell them you heard them on the podcast and thank them for their continued support of the podcast. This is their third series sponsored here on Sefer Chatter. This episode of the series is sponsored by Mosaic Press. Check out their many new titles, including Speaking to God by the late chaplain and innovative Jewish educator Rabbi Zev Schostak, which teaches us that tefillah is more than merely reciting prayers, but a way to speak to God and develop a close relationship with Him. Showing us how prayer is a way to approach God with love and inspiration, this sefer will guide you toward developing a deeper, more personal approach to prayer. Mosaic Press is renowned for its expert editors and designers, bringing together top Jewish minds. Their influential books capture a worldwide audience, sparking meaningful conversations across our community. Get your copy now at mosaicapress.com and use the code CHATTER, that's CHATTER, for an exclusive 15% off. And I'll put a link in the show's notes for this book, and in general, to check out Mosaic Press and their many titles. To sponsor an individual episode for this series, or for any other episode, please email me, sfarmchatter@gmail.com, and see the links in the show's notes below. Additionally, there will be connected essays and kind of a written post for each episode of this series with kind of behind the scenes information, how I got to the episode, what I thought about it, and things like that at the new Svarim Chatter Substack. And for those of you not familiar with Substack, it's basically a blog, but it gets sent via email, or you can use the Substack app and you can check it out. Also, Substack, so that's free, and the episodes in this series will be free. But Substack does offer a paid option. It's $5.99 a month or $60 a year, or there's a founding member, which is very appreciative, $180 a year. And that is for Svarim Chatter. It's a way to support Svarim Chatter if you want to, without a sponsorship, just something less. And also, there will be bonus content on the Substack. Not necessarily about the 10 Lost Tribes, but in general for those who subscribe, and some of that is actually starting very soon. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, especially if you use Apple Podcasts. I really appreciate those that have rated and reviewed. It does help the podcast. And finally, there's a Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community. There's an admin-only chat where I post new books and Svarim and things like that, as well as there are 2 associated chats where you can talk about Svarim and the podcast. And there's a link to that in the show's notes. And with that, enjoy the episode, the second in the series. And as always, if you have any feedback, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. If you're on the WhatsApp chats, message me on WhatsApp, and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast, and another episode here in the ongoing series on Svarim Chatter entitled The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. For this episode of the series, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Fishel Mael, who is the mechaber of the sefer Shevet Yisrael, which discusses the 12 Shevatim. But I think it's important to have in this series, actually, Rabbi Fishel reached out to me when I mentioned, I think on the Spain series, or one of the other series, as one of the introductions there, either the Spain series or a regular episode, how I was thinking of working on this series here on the 10 Lost Tribes. And I think that I thought it was a good idea, although the series is about the 10 Lost Tribes and it's talking about them, I think it's important to understand what the Shevatim were, rather than just going into this thinking that, Jews here, Jews there, some lost, some around, and it's all the same. Everyone's just, Yidden, everyone's just Jewish. I think it's important if we talk about specific Shevatim, their different special attributes, special things about them, where they were from, where they lived, various differences about them, and we can discuss that, especially a lot of this from a Torah-based background, like our official does in his sefer Shevet Yisrael. So thank you, official, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Hey, I grew up near Boston on a farm. My great-grandfather was one of the founders of the Boston Hasidus. I later went to yeshiva in Sifta of Long Beach for high school, and I went to Eretz Yisrael for yeshiva and kollel with a short while in Eretz Yisrael Yeshiva Negev.
So how did you become interested in this topic of the Shevatim? And I should mention your sefer has been published a number of times. There's been a number of editions. So you printed this. You'll be able to tell me the first time it was printed, but it's been a few decades, I think. And yes. It's been I think it's a 4th edition or 5th edition. So how did you get into this? And something that you've been continuously revising and redoing and working on for years.
This is a real case of Libo Chafetz. I started to gravitate to the topic when I was giving chaburas in yeshiva. In fact, the first piece in the sefer is from my berachos. And I just kept coming back to it. And obviously, it chose me as a topic. I will say that before I ever got into learning, I had an interest as a kid in the states of America and the presidents. Seeing this concept of different subgroups making a whole was always interesting. And I finally got a focus on it when I got to the Shevatim.
So why did you decide, though, to write a sefer, to put together an entire work about the Shevatim?
I was saying chaburas, and as I was leaving kollel, my rebbeim urged me to continue what I was doing. There needed to be a format for it, and it wasn't going to be with Bachram that much. I started to do the research, and it just became immersive.
Okay, so let's jump into it. Let's jump into the Shevatim. Again, even though the series on Aseret Shevatim, this is on the Shnei Moshe Shevatim, on the 12 Shevatim. So let's start off, who were the 12 tribes? Right off the bat, a simple question.
Yaakov had 12 sons and a daughter. His first wife, Leah, had 4 sons at one time and 2 sons later on. He also had a maidservant, Zilpah, who had 2 sons. His other wife, Rachel, had 2 children, 2 sons, and her maidservant, Bilhah, had 2 sons, a total of 12. How they're organized is different ways of organizing them, as we'll see.
Right, so and one thing that you do discuss right in the beginning, you have a chart about the birth order. I think it's important to discuss that right here, that it's not always the simple, way it's listed. So there's different opinions. So if you want to talk about the order of the Shevatim that they were born in.
Right. Some people take the Torah's list as literally chronological. Others have midrashim that interleave that after Levi was born, Bill and Zilpah start to have children. But I think for most purposes, the chronological order is significant. Although I would tell you that sometimes you'll find chronological order based on within mothers. That means you'll have all 6 of Leah's children, then 2 of Bill, then 2 of Zilpah, and then 2 of Rachel. Notably in the Choshen, according to Ben Abachi, which is the most common opinion, you find the first 6 stones are all children of Leah.
Okay, so you lay this out in a chart in the beginning of the sefer. You have Rashi's opinion, like Achtoiv and the Ramban, and then you also have a chart with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 opinions on the Shevatim and the months and the mazalis, the constellations. So that you have another chart as well discussing that. So let's talk about the subgroups, breaking the Shevatim down into subgroups. You mentioned that there were different mothers, different imayas of the Shevatim. So what about the subgroups of the
Okay. The foundational source of this part of the sefer comes from Tzaddik of Lublin. He wrote extensively. There are 2 main groups: the Bnei Leah and the Bnei Rachel. Bnei Leah would seemingly fit in the mold of Avram Avinu. Their nisyonos were in the areas of arayas, forbidden relationships, just like Yishmael was a spin-off of Avram for the bad. Rachel, on the other hand, had children who were not subject to this type of temptations, but they had issues more with kina and sinna, fighting and strife. That was more on the line of Yitzchak and Dinan, and more when they had failings, it was more along the lines of Esav's failings. So Tzaddik basically left it as these 2 major groups. I guess what I uncovered over the work on the sefer was the 3rd significant group, and that is the 2 shvachos together. That is not 4 groups, but 3 groups. And I get this partially from the Torah in the beginning of our sefer Bamidbar. He says at length why he thinks Bnei Shvachos is one entity. Really, you see this at the end of Vayishlach. When Lavan is going through the tent, he goes through Rachel, Ol Leah, and the Ol HaShvachos. Bachi makes the point that it's all one group. Finally, you see in the Maral, in the beginning of Ner Mitzvah, it says the word Echad stands for the Dalet is the 4 children of the Shvachos, the 8 is the Bnei Rachel Leah, and the 1 is Levi. We'll come back to that later, but the point is, you see they're pulled together. What does this 3rd group do? That's the key issue. What is the group? So when you notice, when Leah has her children, she has 4 children in the beginning. She names them, she does everything. Same with Rachel. When it comes to Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, the children of Bill and Zilpah, each time it says Ben Yaakov. If we go with the Maral, which I discussed later, he says there was a hisbadlus of Leah and Rachel. We're giving the shvachos to the entity of Yaakov. Yaakov is the 3rd midah in between midah of Rachel and Leah, just like Yaakov is the midah in between Avram and Yitzchak's chesed and gevura. So that it's a calmer midah in some way. It's not as strong an emphasis as you have in the children of Leah and Rachel. I showed in a number of places that Bnei Shvachos actually act as buffers between the Bnei Rachel and Leah. They're the peacemakers, especially Asher and Naphtali. They have Shimon Zayis, which symbolizes peace, and they marry the kings and on them. They're the bridge and the link between the other ones. But as the 3rd group, they have this meat of Tiferes, more of Yaakov, but also with the nisyonos of Avodah Zarah, as opposed to the nisyonos of Arias and Resicha. One group that's an exception is Yisachar and Zvulun. Yisachar and Zvulun are the later children of Leah, but they're a little different. If you notice by birth, it says Ben Chamishil Yaakov, Ben Shishil Yaakov. They're almost like tacked on to the Bnei Shvachos. And the answer is that they were, once the Shvachos were brought into the picture, it wasn't the same intensity of the relationship between Yaakov and Leah. So they have a partial relationship to the Shvachos. And if you look at a map of Eretz Yisrael, you'll find that in the south is all the children of Leah, Shimon, Yehuda, Ruvain. The middle is the children of Rachel, Yamin, Ephraim, and Asher. Up top is children of Bill and Zilpah mainly, Dan, Naphtali, and Asher. But nestled in there above the children of Yosef, and below the Shvachos is Ephraim, is not Yisachar and Zvulun, because they're middle but upper middle. They're almost like a swing vote. They're the calmer ones. They're not as much leaders per se. They're not the kingdom family. They're not the opposition family, but they are a buffer as well. That's how he fleshed out. That was the main overview of the 12 Shevatim, how they break down.
Now, the important one here is Levi. Where does Levi fall? When we talk about 12 Shevatim, as we kind of buried the lead a little there, where is Levi? Is Levi included in those 12 Shevatim, or are you breaking out Yosef into two, and Ephraim and Asher, and we're not including Levi, so then it's essentially 13?
Well, that's a very good question. I already mentioned Maral, that the number 13 encompasses both versions, both Levi and Ephraim and Asher. But in truth, it's either or. You find there's a source for one designation of the Shvatim, which is to go in the order that they were in the desert. That itself comes from a medrash when Yaakov died. He asked his sons, please stand around my bed and stand on this side. The side that they stayed on would be the side that they would occupy in the desert. Levi is left up because he's like the Rebbe, and Yosef himself is left up because he's a king. So that's why Ephraim and Asher slip in that 12. That's the same 12 you have with the Karbonos of the Nisim in Parshas Naso, when each one gave a carbon after the other. That follows the order going clockwise around the midbar. When Levi is included, then you drop Ephraim and Asher. For example, in the Choshen, Levi is part of the 12 tribes there. Hargrizim Har Evo, Levi is actually very interesting. If you look carefully in Kisavo, Levi is on one of the mountains, and Har Grizim, also down in the middle with the Klanim. But there's no Ephraim and Asher in that listing. It's either one or the other. Now, at a certain level, blessed level, there's going to be a shlom of what should have been Midrashim that Yaakov could have got together with Bilhah if Reuven hadn't intervened. It would have been 2 extra children, would have been Yosef, Ephraim, and Menashe. Medina would have been 15, that would have been Shiftei Kav. But that's going to be left for the future.
So let's just go back for a minute. I mentioned that you have these charts as well. You talk about the months and some other things. If you want to talk a little bit about that before we go on.
So there's implication in Sefer Yetzirah and other places. The months are tied to the Shevatim, or that the Shevatim actually inform the months of the year. Are informed by the astrological signs. So there's different formulations. Rabbi Schostak says they all have a truth at one level. I stuck with the one which was the Arizal and the Gruz understanding of Sefer Yetzirah, which again goes with the order of the Golem in the camp. That is, you start from the east, you work your way down. Yehuda Yisachar Zulun goes with the first 3 months of the spring, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, and you go to the next southern group, which is Reuven, Shimon, Gad, which corresponds to the months Tammuz, Av, and El, the summer Shvatim, so to speak. Then you keep moving to the west. You've got Ephraim, Menashe, and Yamin tied to the months of Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev. Finally, you move up north. You get to three of the 4 Bnei Shvachos, Dan, Asher, Naphtali, corresponding to Tevei, Shvat, and Adar. Now, this order is used by a number of Sefarim to describe what the months have to do with that Shevet. For example, Bnei Yisachar follows that pattern. Tzaddik and the Pri Tzaddik follows that pattern, as well as others. I tried to go with one thing. I've heard other people give shiurim. They say it's this one according to this one, or that one. But I find it very confusing to tell you simultaneously every month is 4 different people. And it becomes just like two loose connections. So I stuck with one time for this go around.
So generally, the order that you're going with is the chronological order, birth order. But does it matter on the mothers, or does it go straight?
It's actually not the birth order. It's actually the order in the desert that's laid out in the first chapter of Bamidbar. So Yehuda Yisachar's will go first. They're not chronological. What it is the children of Leah are the first two groupings of 3. Children of Rachel are the next groupings, and the children of the Shvach are the last 3 groupings.
Now talk about
yeah.
Okay, no, go ahead.
The main chronological place you find is in the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. That is chronological, but within mothers.
Now let's talk about those, the golem and being in the midbar, and also, as you mentioned, each Shevet has their own stone on the Kohen Gadol, on the Choshen. So what does this tell us about the Shevatim, those groupings of the golem and just the stones in general?
So part of my goal was to define as much as possible what the central traits or mitos were of each Shevet. A Shevet is defined by what their characteristics are, what their nisyonis are, who their affiliations are, where they are in Eretz Yisrael. All of this was fair game, so to speak, to flesh out the picture. When the Shevatim were in the Midbar, They'd already divided themselves into tribes. They had different lanes, so to speak, when they went through Kriyas Yamsuf. They'd already been designated by Yaakov to stand around his bed in a different way. It just needed to be fleshed out and defined. They already had brachos from their father Yaakov. Brachos, to a certain extent, define what they were. It heightened the awareness of what they could be. Oftentimes, it focused on something they had done. That was their shining moment. For example, Shevet Shimon, they were criticized about things in Shem. Their flag had Shem on it. Because at a certain level, their Mesiras Nefesh, their kanas against mistreatment of their sister, was something to be very proud of. So you can have both some criticism on something and also be a shining moment. So a number of the Shevatim have on their flags either an animal, epitomize a trait that they have, whether it's a nachash, whether it's a Naphtali's deer, the speed is Rizas, which typifies Naphtali, the chamor, which is not always a complimentary thing, but in Yisachar's case, it means pack animal that works very hard and diligently in Torah. So you have animals. You may have other things from stories. For example, the Reuven's flag, you have dudaim. You have the plant that he brought for his mother, and was extra careful not to steal, which they describe. Not always easy for a firstborn not to try to grab more. So that appears on their stone, on their flag. Besides the flags, you have the stones. The stones are in the breastplate of Kohen Gadol. They have schools. The main source for the stones is you look at Rabbeinu Bachya in Parshas Tetzaveh, and he goes through each stone and what the schools are of the stones. So very fascinating stuff. For example, it says in Shevet Dun that are like a serpent, no shechik feisus. He bites the heels of the horse, and the rider falls off. Naphtali is the antithesis. Naphtali is being a swift deer, and his Rizas is the antithesis of the serpent. And actually, he's compared to a rider who doesn't fall off. And Rabbeinu Bachya says the stone of Shevet Naphtali is Shevo. Shevel points out Shevo is plural for horses in French. They're the riders that they're not slowed down by the nachash of dun, so to speak. It's hard because they just keep moving. So there's various ways of checking out these stones, but it's an area we're not that familiar with nowadays, that the metaphysical qualities of stones. But you take the banner and the stone together. You also take the location as well, as I mentioned. In north and south has implications. Who your neighbors are implications. And then you take the berachos of Moshe and Yaakov together, and you start to get a fleshed out picture of the Shevet. That's how I treated Shevet separately.
And this is something you do in the sefer. I should mention, you do have in the beginning mamarim kolim, general kind of mamarim, general chapters, and then you go through each one. You have a chapter on each Shevet. And I think, again, part of this episode here, especially being in the series, is to point out, as you say, the unique characteristics of each Shevet, which they had. So as you mentioned already, you mentioned the Golem, you mentioned being on the Choshen, but there's also another part, is also the brachos. Obviously famous, Yaakov Avinu gives them brachos at the end of his life in Vaychi, and Moshe Rabbeinu also gives each Shevet a bracha. So how does that inform us of each specific quality or characteristics of each Shevet?
So with rare exceptions, most people are just defining the brachos is defining what is their role in life. How do they contribute to the klal? I'd say Yaakov are somewhat more how the individual Shevet has to deal themselves, how they have to overcome their tendencies. Yaakov, Reuven's for impulsiveness, Shimon Levi for being hot-headed, and they define what they can contribute as an individual. Moshe gets more into, from a historical situation, how they're contributors to the general klal. You need people who are the pushers, the drivers. Anyone who go out to other countries and do export-import, you need people who stay home and keep integrity. That's the difference between the different Shevatim in there. And it expresses itself in the people in Tanach who came from those Shevatim. And I try to a good extent to show how they embody characteristics that were mentioned for the Shevet. Many times it actually alludes to the person, like in Dun's bracha by Yaakov, alludes greatly to Shimon.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's important to mention specific individuals from Tanach that show this. As we're sitting here discussing various characteristics of the Shevatim, and in the sefer you go through even more in depth. We're not going to go through each Shevet here specifically, and each aspect, each characteristic of them, a special quality, but it's important to show that there are individuals that we see in Tanach that did embody these characteristics. You mentioned Shimon and Dun. Do you have any others that you want to mention as well?
Yes. Shevet Yehuda is known for being not affected by Avodah Zarah compared to other Shevatim. They're not vulnerable. And the key people later on didn't give in to Avodah Zarah despite great pressure was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, all in the Navi. And Mordechai is called Yehudi because he's called for Avodah Zarah. That's one example. Another medrash says that Rachel had the meat of shtika. She didn't give away the secrets of the simanim. She gave them to Leah and didn't tell Yaakov what was going on. And that's a big schusr. You remember that Rachel Mavakal Baneh, she has a schus that none of the other of us have to try to hold back the churban. This meat of shtika expresses itself time and again in Binyamin. Binyamin's stone is called the Yashvei. Yesh Pev Eino Magid. He knows it's Yosef, he doesn't say a word. It expresses itself in Shol, expresses itself in Esther and Mordechai, not telling who she is. It's another example of a Shevet expressing itself. And even Ruvain was Poseh B'tshuva, first one to do tshuva, even on a thing that was an intention, not an action. And Hosea is the one who says Shuv Yisrael. We'll be saying next week, Shabbos Shuv Yisrael is from the Navi Hosea, came from Ruvain.
Okay, so now we will discuss some Aseres Shevatim. It's important to discuss meaning the Aseres Shevatim, which is as in the 10 lost tribes, the part of this series, the main title, what the series is about. But I just want to ask you before that, before we even get into that, were there any Shevatim that were considered special or more important? Obviously, Yehuda is Malchus, and you have Bechar was given to Yosef from Ruvain. Are there any? Is that accurate? Are they considered more, important than others?
Very good question. On one hand, we stress that they're all equal at some level. Some they nickel together. But if I can borrow tongue-in-cheek from Animal Farm, all Shvatim are equal, some are more equal than others. If you look at Har Grizim and Har Evel, there's a little indication. Parshas Re'eh mentions the beginning of the parsha of the Haftorah, 5 different stones. Look at the Malbim. He identifies these 5 stones as being the stones of Yehuda, Yisachar, Binyamin, Yosef, and Levi. And then it just says, and all other precious stones. Clearly seems to be better. So when you look at Har Grizim and Har Evel, Mepharshim have a very hard time why Har Grizim had the 6 people that it had. But if you look at the 6 there, it is in fact Yehuda, Yisachar, Levi, Yosef, Binyamin. The 6th one, Shimon, is kind of nichal in Yehuda because we know from later on that Shevet Shimon did not have a separate portion. Its cities interwoven into the Nachla of Yehuda. Shimon did not get a bracha in Parshas Bracha, but it says Shema Hashem Kol Yehuda. That Shimon kind of sneaks in under the guise of Yehuda, so that's why he's together on Har Grizim with the other 5. It would appear that there's an upper group and a lower group, so to speak.
So let's get into some other questions about the Shevatim. Intermarriage, so to speak, between Shevatim, one Shevet to another Shevet. That originally they didn't, then they did. What's the story with that, and how common, how prevalent was that? Did they prefer to stay amongst the Shevet, or did they marry out into the other Shevatim?
Good question. The first generation coming into Eretz Yisrael had to stay married within their Shevet. You know, from the story of Beno Slavchad. I believe the reason was they wanted the integrity of each Nachli. There's a sefer where Shimon Yochai says there's 13 times it says Ar at the beginning of Parshas Eikev, and that tells you there's 13 different lands, so to speak. People had different lands, they had different kochos. People in Usher did primarily fruit trees, mainly olive trees. Naphtali also gave fruits and things of that nature. Others were bread baskets of wheat. Others were wayfarers in export-import industry. So they wanted the integrity. They wanted them certain meters to be found in abundance in 13 different flavors, so to speak, rather than just kind of homogenized all one flavor. But that had its own problems. When you stovepipe people, as we know, start to get factions. So after one generation, it was allowed to remarry within other Shvatim, and that's part of the happiness of the holiday of Tu B'Av. Nevertheless, Rabbeinu Bachya says we still prefer, at least by some Shvatim, stay within the Shevet, and the Shofet Yiftach is called in the Navi Ben Ish Zona. Rabbi says it does not mean that his mother was a harlot. It means that she was from a different Shevet, and she was spoken of disparagingly where he lived as having come from a mixed marriage. So it seems that at least some of the people did not approve of it. However, we certainly have some very esteemed people in the history of Klal Yisrael who were from mixed marriages. Notably, Mordechai came from Yehuda and Binyamin. Shimon came from Yehuda and Dan. Yonah, the Navi, came from Zvulun and Asher. And there are others like that also. I would say it was definitely accepted, but some people were more than others wanted to keep more homogeneity within the shape.
Okay, so here, let me ask you a general question about the sefer, and then we'll get to the Aseres Shevatim part, which is, again, as I said, you go through, you have these general chapters in the beginning, where another thing you discuss the Seder Meraglim, which we didn't mention, but you discuss some things there that we did discuss, like the Shevatim Har Gerizim and Har Evel, where the Shevatim were in the Midbar, where they were in Eretz Yisrael, etc. Then you go through the remaining chapters of the sefer. The bulk of the sefer is Shevet Ruvain, Shevet Shimon, Shevet Levi, Shevet Yehuda. You go through each Shevet throughout. Are there any specific characteristics that you want to mention that are particularly jump out at you, or things that people don't know? Maybe, I mean, probably a lot of these people don't know. You can be picking any Shevet.
People have mentioned that the thing they gained most from this sefer was hearing about the four Shevatim of the Shvachos, that is Dan, Asher, Naphtali, and Gad. That's because they get very short berachos. They don't have too many people who are long-term Malchus or Kahuna and everything. I think people, as I mentioned before, these Shevatim had sort of a bridge role. They were almost like the peacemakers. Let's take Shevet Asher, for example. Shevet Asher was known for providing the olive oil for the whole country. Olive oil was also known as a cosmetic. So the women of Shevet Asher were very beautiful, and they were married to Malachim and Kohanim. That means, if you think about it, I know you had on your Spain thing that marriage often tied families together, families of esteem. If Asher were the wives of all these important people, they were the sister-in-laws and sisters. That allowed them to be a bridge to make peace between the different factions of strong views. Naphtali was interesting to me. Naphtali is has the fruits that are sweetest, Eretz Genoser, so to speak. There's a lot of Kabbalistic stuff in the portion of Naphtali, mainly the cities of Tveria and Tzfat. And there's more than brachas of people going to Genoser to eat fruits and people going out of their mind and having sugar attack, which obviously means the more Kabbalistic things. In fact, there's not well known that the Torah of Naphtali is probably the source of the Kabbalistic directions in Klal Yisrael. That's just two of those. Gad was a very different group. Gad were very ascetic warriors. They wanted to stay in Ever Yarden, not so much because of their animals, although that's mentioned, because they wanted to stay where Moshe was buried. They were very tied to this idea of Halacha Moshe Sinai. The form of learning of Pilpul really started after the death of Moshe when they came to Eretz Yisrael. In the Midbar, it was Halacha Moshe Sinai. And the person who stands up from Shevet Gad is Eliyahu. Eliyahu is going to come eventually and resolve all our questions. Eliyahu is going to be this throwback, so to speak, to the time of Halacha Moshe Sinai. They're much more straightforward, tough border patrol, so to speak.
And as you said, the other Shvatim are more well-known, so to speak. So this is the part that people find more interesting. So let's talk about Aseres Shvatim, the Aseres Shvatim. So first of all, who are the Aseres Shvatim that ended up first breaking away from Yehuda, that comprised Malchus Yisrael, and then ended up being lost?
Okay, the 10 tribes are not ever exactly mentioned, since they're not listed. We assume that they're the following. We assume that they are from Ruvain, Yisachar, Zvulun, Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali. That is the four children of the Shvachos, three of the four sons of Leah, and Ephraim and Manasseh. If you want a tenth, you similarly have to put Shimon in there. Because Shimon is not Yehuda, is not Binyamin. However, go to the 8th parak of Masechah Sota, talking about the exhortations of the Mashuach Melchama, warning people to be fearless. And it says, people you're going to fight with are really dastardly people. It's not like Yehuda fighting Shimon, not like Shimon fighting Binyamin. It says in Marsho, why are you mentioning Shimon Yom Yehuda of all people. It must be that when they had the goals of the 10 Shevatim, Shimon, whose cities are interwoven in the cities of Yehuda, they never left. They're part of that group. Unbelievable. Clearly, you don't have a 10th tribe just yet, but you think about this, it's a whole different spin on Shimon. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the Parshas Maseh, list the people who are going to be the Nasim going into Eretz Yisrael, with 12 people, and by 9 of them it says the word Nasi, so to speak. 3 of them it doesn't, Yehuda, Binyamin, and Shimon. Or we're bothered, why did it say Nasi over there? But with what we're saying with the Marsha, it's really understandable. Anybody who's part of the eventual Malchus that lasted through the second Malchus doesn't get the name Nasi. They're like Tafel to the king. The other ones who broke off, they have the word Nasi. The question is, who's the 10th tribe? So I can't go into it now, but I have an extensive thing trying to show that eventually the second part of Menashe becomes the 10th tribe, and they have a connection to Shimon. So find a copy and.
Yeah, the Shimon part is an issue. I know one of the academics in this series has written on this as well. Perhaps I'll do an episode on that from that angle. But there is the Shimon part, like you said, is the issue. Is Shimon one of the Aseret Shevatim or not? And Shimon, as you mentioned, was by Yehuda, the area of Yehuda. So they weren't even in the area. So Shimon is kind of a problem. But
correct.
Yes. So there's, like you said, ways around it, but that's to mention. Okay. So, just, to conclude, so are you going with the Shita that, are you saying that Shimon is one of the 10 or Shimon is not? So Shimon is part of remaining today and Shimon is not one of the Aseret Shevatim that was exiled, lost.
I'm going with the assumption that Shimon stays with Yehuda and Yamin.
Okay.
I should mention there are different opinions. There seems to be agreement that somebody from the 10 Shevatim is still there. There's a Gemara that says that Yirmiyahu brought some of the 10 Shevatim back.
Yes.
But you see individual cases, you see Umar and Pesachim, Daf Dalad, where somebody says, I want to go on the ship, I want to go, sail away. They found he was from Zvulun. Another guy was very litigious. So every time he had a chance, he'd say, let's go to court, let's go to court. They found he was from Dan. This was time of the Gemara. And in time of Achashverosh, he was having trouble find a loophole to keep his wife Vashti alive, called in the Chum of Yisachar. Yisachar was obviously from the 10 tribes. It means there were individuals stayed behind. So it's good for us metaphysically to know we have people from all 12 Shevatim coursing through Klal Yisrael's veins.
Right, especially if one also considers Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the Mishnah, which is that the Aseret Shevatim are gone and never coming back. So there are no more Aseret Shevatim in that. So, like you're saying, there were some left in Klal Yisrael because the Aseret Shevatim, quote unquote, are gone, according to Rabbi Akiva. So that's what you're saying. So some of them were remaining. Now, did the Shevatim get along with each other?
Some Shevatim were more prone to civil war strife. This is what I mentioned before from Rav Tzadok. The Bnei Rachel had more issues with competition, jealousy, fighting, strife. You find Yerav Menavat of Ephraim split off. Find Binyamin had to fight with all of Klal Yisrael, another of Rachel's children. Ephraim and Menashe, I believe, have a scuffle in sefer Shoftim. You don't really find it with the other Shevatim. You never find Yisachar and Zvulun fighting with each other, or Yehuda and Naphtali. It's just when it happens. And keep in mind, Menashe was a Shevet of Yiftach who objected to intermarriage. There was a certain part of almost states' rights, if I even say that, more focused on keeping our own Shevet's integrity and not being, caving into other people. But I would hope they got along generally. They certainly made enough efforts to do that through the Chosh and through everything else.
Right. Would you compare it to is an apt analogy of us sitting in the United States, of like various states comprising the United States together. Again, not a complete analogy, lahavdol, not making a comparison to the states, but the point is, as you were saying, distinct parts of a whole rather than completely separate factions.
Well, the Civil War in the South was at some comparability. They felt that their states' rights were being diminished. I think they came around and saw that they were better off not splitting off. You don't see, except for the Sefer Shevatim, you don't find anybody else seating from the Shevatim. I'd have to say that was almost revolutionary. Came through a nevuah that they should even have the audacity to split off and make a separate confederation.
So you mentioned before Marsha, Maral, Reb Tzadok, Oznaim Lateras. You mentioned some earlier, some later Sfarim. Are there, and you mentioned Medrash, of course. What sources in Sfarim did you use? Is it basically everything, essentially, because you kind of covered everything, or were there some specific ones that you leaned on?
Well, I mentioned that Reb Tzadok was very seminal for me in understanding the groupings of Bnei Rachel and Leah. I have to give him the credit for that. And it was basically scaffolding. I started from the Gemara, I started from the Midrashim. I worked my way up to the Rishonim, and the Psukim, then I got to the Maral and Marsha, then to Hasidus and Musar. And I should mention I did not have any online sources at the time. There might have been a benefit. I was not overwhelmed by data. It took many years to gather up the sources, and often by chance, often by having to see a sefer in somebody's house. I wonder if someone was doing this work now, if they would just get overwhelmed with the sheer amount of volume you could generate at one time.
Now, what about Haskamas? You do have a number of Haskamas on the Sefer, so who did you get Haskamas from?
And it's coming from Shmuel Weinberg, that's all the second Rosh of Ner Yisrael. Haskama Yibral L'chaim from Shmuel Kamenetsky. That is Haskama from David Cohen from Brooklyn. A number of other Rabbanim who I didn't know that well, but encouraged me to continue with the Sefer. I had an experience, actually. I went to visit Rav Aaron Schechter after the Sefer was out. And I came to his office and gave him his sefer, and he literally sat there for an hour reading the sefer while I was sitting there. He would look for like 20 minutes and say, "Who'd you learn Maral with?" And I said, "Rabbi Zev." And he said, "Okay." He looked down again, and he kind of picked this up later and said, "Not Lafi Aruch exactly, but it's very good. You must live with it." People were quite encouraging along the way.
Now, as I mentioned, you put out a number of editions. This is the fourth edition? What number edition is this?
This is the fourth edition.
What has been changed throughout the years? When did you originally print it?
I published it in 1997, and 1,500 term went relatively quickly, and now they're going out like 500 at a time. Probably know more than I do about the how and why this farm being published, being spread. The fact that you never heard of it was surprising, in fact.
Yeah, we should tell listeners, when you reached out to me, I said I'd never heard of it. And even when you sent me a copy, I hadn't seen it. I don't know why. But you're saying, we'll talk about it being available where listeners can purchase a copy if they want a copy. And I should mention, it's a pretty big sefer. So it's about over 400 pages, so it's pretty big. But one more thing on the editions, have you changed anything since that original edition, or is it mainly just reprinting it just to put it back in print that it's available for purchase?
I tightened it up. I renumbered the chapters. I redid the index in the back. I should mention who got me focused on this. The Rebbe in Ner Yisrael, who I don't think is known to too many people, except the people who are really in the know. That's Rav Nachum Lansky Shlita, who got me to learn Reb Tzadok, who got me to learn Reb Chal, who helped me working on things. There's a derech here which permeates the chapters. We've talked mainly about the introduction. Which is almost like encyclopedic in the sense of a lot of facts organized. The next ones are more chidushim, more working on chazals that bring out the nature of each shevet. There's probably 4 to 6 chapters on each shevet. And the style there is, if a person just reads the introduction, they're shortchanging themselves. They really should dive in, pick a shevet they like, and read a few of the Maimarim, see if the type of thing they would like.
I was going to say, we're kind of shortchanging the sefer, which, okay, but that is what it is. It's a podcast episode, not an entire sefer. But as you say, you go pretty in depth, a lot of various maimarim, various aspects and things that you talk about Chazal and other things about each shevet that you go through in each chapter. There are sub chapters in the chapters, so to speak.
The thing we haven't mentioned is the months are informed by the holidays in that month, and the months are often informed by the shevet. So I talk a lot about why Naphtali is related to Purim, the month of Adar. It's not an obvious thing. Talk about Reuven and Tammuz. I talk at length about why Hanukkah straddles 2 months. What's the significance of straddling Kislev and Teves? Talking about the Binyamin aspects of Hanukkah and the Don aspects of Hanukkah. I think that's where there's a real room for contribution. Look at it from a different perspective.
Okay, so I will put a link in the show's notes. Well, I'll try, I should say, to put a link in the show's notes where to purchase the sefer. Is the sefer available now? Should it be available in Svarim stores?
Yes, Maznaim is a distributor both in Eretz Yisrael and America. Anybody can go to their store. If the store doesn't have it, they can ask them to order from Maznaim, or they can come to Baltimore, or they can have a friend coming here for a weekend or something. Happy to hand them a sefer.
Okay, so
definitely accessible. And it's been quoted by Rabbi Reisman at least 4 times.
Okay, and I will put
in
that
various daf yomis.
Okay, so I'll put in any information that I can get from you in the show's notes. By the way, I wanted to just mention, you mentioned Nachum Lansky. He was mentioned on the podcast, actually, I believe, because when I interviewed Yehuda Ezrael about his father, he published a sefer, Pnei Moshe. I think Rabbi Lansky has the shtickle in there, in that sefer, so I think he mentioned him. But like you said, not a very well-known figure. So finally, what is the message of the Shevatim that we should take out?
I think there's a very important message here. I've talked to Steven words about this lately. You know, when a person has certain kochos, they may think that to be modest is to say, no, I don't have those kochos. I'm not smart. I'm not this. These things are gifts from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The thing is, a person has to realize that they are gifts. A person is not self-made to be smart or charismatic or connected or have parents who have money and wealth. A person has to realize, I have the gift and I have required to work with them. Shevatim were given different kochos. They didn't necessarily earn them. Some of them were given more kochos of Malchus or Kuna, things fit into their role. It's a pact between the groups. The people who have to not become conceited about what they have. The ones who don't have to not be resentful. To appreciate that if Israel gave gifts to other people, they play their role, we play our role. A lot of times people mention Shevatim around Shevrachs, around Parshat Midbar, almost like a dismissive thing, like there's 12 Shevatim, not everybody can be Levi, not everybody can be Yehuda. Not the point. The point is not that everyone should be and try to compete. Be the best one that you are. That's just the role you have to play. That's the function. And I think that's the message. And it was very interesting. When I finished the Hakdama, the last words I had was Kishachad B'Lev Echad. When I was organizing my mom at the end, I just put them in order. The last ones was Binyamin. I turned at the end of the sefer and I said, "What's the last word in the sefer?" The mimer says, "V'hayil Am Echad." I ended up Kishachad B'Lev Echad, and I ended it with B'Lev Echad. I guess that was permeating the whole sefer without realizing it.
Actually want to ask you one final question. Being that this episode is part of an episode on the Aseret Shevatim, the 10 lost tribes, how should listeners, going forward the rest of the series, or wherever they're listening to this in the series order, how should they view the Aseret Shevatim? Is it just, people think of, like I said in the beginning, there's just Jews, Klal Yisrael, some are missing, some are here, of course, but is it more than just that? Is it more than that, essentially?
I believe we need all 12 Shevatim. We need the kochos they provide. We don't have them accessible the same way. We don't have them accessible even to know who's Binyamin and who's Yehuda, which means we lack. It's like you go to a dispenser and you try to get a drink of this or that, and everything comes all together. Maybe you have a lot of variety, but you just taste one mush. We want the Shevatim to come back. We want them to come back and be in this gala. We mentioned it in the tefillah on Yom Noraim. We mentioned it in a number of places. I think we should aspire to have access to the Shevatim, their completeness, and to know what they are and let them shine in. That would be a benefit to all of us, I believe.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Fishel, for joining me to discuss the 12 Shevatim and the 10 Shevatim. And like I said, I'll put information about how to purchase the sefer in the show's notes for anyone interested. And there's way more in the sefer than we discussed here. We were just scratching the surface. So thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you very much.